I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into it. Okay, guys, we're going to quickly talk, well, not quickly, but actually for a long time, we're going to talk about Chainmail. I'm going to put some timestamps down here so you can kind of jump around. I do plan to go back and make specific videos on the different types of combat, different rule systems, so that that might be easier to access. This is both going to be a understanding of the history of Chainmail and sort of the layout of the PDF and how the game was played in a more broad sense of it. There's going to be a lot of information throughout this, so don't think when they start talking about rules that I'm going to just stick to rules. The whole video is filled with time period, historical statements or accuracies or things I found interesting about the game from that period of time. Chainmail is not the first war game ever that was made. It was built on the shoulders of very stylized games that aimed to be more representative and create a sense of understanding of how reality and war actually works versus what was standard of tokens being pushed around a battlefield. One of the earliest games that was made like this was Kriegspiel. Kriegspiel was made over 100 years by a father-son team that were part of the Prussian army. It was finalized in 1824 according to the Kriegspiel wiki. However, there are a couple dates of when that actually was finalized. This was followed up by the sci-fi novelist H.G. Wells, who made a game called Little Wars in 1913. This is 1 year before the Great War. Though Mr. Gygax spoke of Mr. Wells, he knew the owner of a hobby store better, this Mr. Henry Bodenstadt. Mr. Bodenstadt had a surplus of Hauser Company miniatures from West Germany. These were 40 and 70 millimeter, and he developed a game called Siege of Bodenburg to assist in the sales of these miniatures. From these games and some other things I'll talk about here in a second, Chainmail was conceived as an idea. Mr. Gygax worked with his friend and fellow wargamer, Mr. Jeff Perry, to put their efforts into this game. One of the questions I asked myself was, how did they get this thing going back then? It's not like they had the finances or the platform to stand on. They literally had to go build their own platforms. So, Mr. Gygax's path was to co-found a organization called the International Federal Wargaming, or the IFW. This IFW had about 100 active players, all playing the Siege of Bodenburg, which was a game that was created by Mr. Bodenstadt, the hobby store owner, and was a great source of wargamers to play test and potentially sell his Chainmail game to in the future. At one point, a child, the age of 13, by the name of Robbie, met Mr. Gygax. He would later be known as, well, famous in some circles, as Robert Kuntz. So Mr. Kuntz, Mr. Gygax were friends. Along with another friend of Mr. Gygax, Mr. Don Kay, they co-founded the Lake Geneva Tactical Study Association, or the LGTSA. So now you have the IFW and the LGTSA, which is not only a lot of random letters and hard to follow, but they're also kind of like two circles of friends, both in different areas, both with their own intricacies and play styles, all slightly different. And you'd probably be a little scared to introduce these two like you would two circles of friends, because they both know you as having something a little bit different. What united these two groups was the Geneva Convention, now known as Gen Con. Gen Con was the original place for war games. It was later used heavily for roleplay games and would be considered the origin convention probably for both of these in modern history. This got both groups in the same place. Ideas were transferred and shared between them, and without Gen Con, a Mr. Jerry White would never have traveled from Portland, Oregon to share the use of his Elastian figurines or miniatures. Mr. Gygax thought very highly of these pre-painted miniatures, but the cost was not prohibitive. They were 50 cents a miniature back then, and the Siege of Bodenstadt, or the Siege of Bodenberg, would have several hundred miniatures on the board at the same time. It was said that they played all the way through closing and even a little bit on, faking cleaning so they could get a few more moves in, another turn, so that the game could be resolved. Often sharing duties of pushing a broom around to make it seem like they were cleaning. In the second convention, Mr. Gygax played a game with a Mr. Dave Arneson. The game was called Blackmoor, which was a version of Braunstein, which was actually created by Major Dave Wesley. This game of Blackmoor inspired Mr. Gygax to come up with a more fantasy lean towards his Chainmail game, which was already released. He created the fantasy appendix, 15 pages of optional rules that he put on the back of Chainmail. Was that something that Mr. Perrin, the co-founder or the co-author of Chainmail, approved of? I won't say that he never changed his opinion, but he was not fond of the idea of hobbits and dragons being placed into his historical Chainmail game. I would hope that his position on that softened over the years. But let's not just gloss over what I talked about with Major Wesley. Major Wesley, in the 1960s, before Chainmail was even made, created something called Braunstein. Braunstein was also based off of the Napoleonics of the time, and different other games like Diplomacy and Stratego. I would say that he had a keen understanding of how games were played back then. I'm not going to gush too much over Major Wesley. I have a complete video, nearly 2 hours long, if you would like to go check it out. I will post a link down below to it, and it has a lot of really great information. And Braunstein is still a game that is played currently at GaryCon. Mr. Gygax went by the name of Gary versus Ernie. That is why the cover to all the products say Gary Gygax versus Ernie Gygax. Ernest Gygax is actually one of Mr. Gygax's children, who is also a game developer. So when you see Ernie Gygax, that is one of his earliest works before he adopted the name Gary. This is important when you see the special thanks section of this book. The information I'm pulling from is off of the PDF I bought off of drivethrurpg.com. It is the third edition of the game. It's probably the one they were playing around the release of the original Dungeons & Dragons. I feel like it meets that standard better. I'm also pulling a lot of my information that I'm using in this video off of interviews and other videos that are first or second hand sources. I feel like what I'm talking about is very accurate. And Mr. Gygax has strengths and he has weaknesses like all of us. I would say his creative juices and ability to connect things together that are not standard are very high. I would also like to say he probably could have hired an editor to help organize the book better. I think those are both fair statements. I will also say it's important not to minimize this game and its importance by comparing it to the polished modern versions of the games that have had over 50 years to improve upon the vocabulary that is used, the branding styles, the art that goes with it, and the layout format that is now being used. Instead, let's go ahead and jump into this. Now, there are a few systems you will have to learn if you want to play all of Chainmail. So I'm going to quickly list what those different systems are, and I'm going to put timestamps down at the bottom of my video so that you might be able to find them relatively easy. First, we have man-to-man, then we have jousting, then we have fantasy, then we have mass combats, post-morale, resolution, which I'll call resolution is probably my addition to the word. Then you have morale, then you have siege warfare. It's important to see that this is the third edition of the game. It was printed in 1979. As this was after the Tolkien estate said no to several elements of the books, like treants and hobbits and balrogs. In this version of the game, they were removed, and things like hobbits were changed to halflings, and certain other things like balrogs were just completely removed. These games were played on surfaces that were called sand tables, as you can see here. These tables were often a lot larger than tables we play on today. Movement in historical combat tends to be structured with units, where units were not skirmishers, and the formations could not just fit anywhere. They had turning radiuses and all sorts of stuff when they wheeled. They'd have to reform the direction they were facing. All of this costs movement, generally. So the tables back then, at least Mr. Gygax's table, was 6 foot by 10 foot. Just like now, though, back then, they used a lot of different types of materials, some in combination of other styles. One of the more popular was a modular style for a sand table. These would be like 2 foot by 2 foot sections you would add to an already surface, or something like a ping pong table, so that you could go ahead and play your game. One of the common problems we run into in modern day games, and it was even a problem back then, was that range was more powerful because it could kill you at distance, and there were specific units out there that were overpowered compared to others. One of the ones in the Chainmail version of the game was considered to be pikemen, because they would go first and because they would kill and you would have less to come back with them on. They would be considered more powerful. Same with ranged units. They would dwindle units down to ineffective sizes, so that they would be less effective against the large blocks of troops that your own troops would be able to muster. It was less of a consideration to try and balance units against each other. It was accepted that horsemen would win heads-up battle against footmen and would lose against pikemen. If a footman got the surprise, the flank, or the rear attack on cavalry, they would potentially turn that battle. There were often normal tradeaways, though. Horsemen were better at going after archers because of the speed. Footmen were had larger amounts versus the cost of cavalry, so were better at fighting pikemen, for example. But the reason why they didn't try and go for balance was units weren't historically balanced. Some things were just better. There was not a lot of things with stat blocks back then. You didn't have strength or intelligence or stamina involved in your units. It was very binary. It was based upon your armor versus the weapon being attacked, if the person was skilled or if they were not skilled with that weapon. This was not unique to Chainmail. This was a very common technique used in war games back at that time. Also not unique to Chainmail was the use of morale. It was very important that combat would continue until one of the units lost morale, and this would turn the battle, potentially, in a very epic and decisive way. Battles in the Middle Ages were not fought to the last man. These were farmers. These were conscripted units. These were people that did not fight for their own land, were not fighting for their own freedom. They were often required to be there by some noble or lord. Victory conditions were not necessarily required, but they were often agreed to as a set condition before the game, so that you would not have fighting to the last man. The Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association, or as I said before, the LGTSA, was the home for many of these medieval games. So the addition of the fantasy appendix added to the third edition was a bit surprising. However, it was very well received, and it brought a brand new way to play this game and to bring into this historical type of game the fantasy elements that many of the players also loved. It combined things that were not naturally put together. This is some of the reason why Mr. Gygax's strong language was in these early versions of the game. He was battling perceptions and understandings and what people liked, the tradition of the time. This was also a dividing point for Mr. Perrin and for Mr. Gygax. Mr. Gygax wrote the rules for Chainmail to be played with a larger scale of miniature that is used today. He loved the Elastilin miniatures and the Starlux figures, which were both 40 millimeter. But as long as the scale stays the same across the board, you can find cheaper alternatives. For example, there was the Airflix Robin Hood miniatures and the Sheriff Nottingham, which were 25 millimeter. These also can be used. As long as they were all 25 millimeter, the scale was the same. In most wargames, there are standard rules. A turn sequence is pretty standard. But it seems those who goes first is rolled each turn. This is an interesting dynamic that shows the fog of war, or the lag of information, the unexpected turn as people get to go twice versus he goes, she goes, he goes, she goes, or whatever. However, generally, after movement you have artillery, then followed by missile, then followed by melee. That's a standard order which was used here too. This is part of the reason why ranged is so powerful, as it goes before melee. And of course the turn sequences, when you get done with that order, you start over. I've seen simultaneous movement work in other games as well. This would work here too. It was a bit odd, the writing of orders for each unit and then secretively playing it, and then you move as if, you don't know what's happening until it happens. I kind of like this. It reminds me a bit of a game I played back in around 2000. It was called Duel Master 2, I believe, and it was a gladiator fighting simulator that was played through the mail. You would mail in your orders, and then you would get back the fight and that type of stuff. It worked out well. I really enjoyed that game, but it was definitely of an older mindset. Whichever version of the turn sequence you would use would be something that both players would agree to at the beginning of the game, or if you're part of a campaign, would be agreed to probably at the start of the campaign and not switched between each war. I also found the rules for terrain to be extremely standard, such things as you can't charge a unit that's on top of a hill. The unit coming down the hill has maybe a bonus. This seems very typical for a historical wargame approach. You know that the standard rough terrain types, rivers, and hills stop charges. A unit on top of a hill has a better line of sight to units on the ground or below it, so that it's able to shoot easier, whereas a unit that's on top of the hill might not be seen as easily and would have more of a line of sight issue. Trees block line of sight. Marshes slow ground troops, but, for example, you can be shot. This makes the addition of the fantasy element shift everything. For example, units can now fly, so a marsh might be very effective against certain troops, but allow flying units to just fly over it. Flying units might have a real problem going through a forest where a ground unit could just walk through it. How far a unit can move in a turn is also very important. If they are within range, or if they can move through the range faster than the unit can defend itself, are all factors into how effective that unit really is. If a unit is so big it requires more time to wheel or change formation versus being nimble across the battlefield, that is a factor. Many smaller units could be more useful than one large unit. Having a unit that is a skirmisher, as in it doesn't actually keep a strict formation, will allow you to travel through certain things more nimbly, because you don't have to wheel or change your formation when moving. You just move. One of the things I appreciated, but I could see it being a bit of an encumbrance on the play of the game, was the use of fatigue. Units can only move so many turns before they start to take negatives. In this case, they're counted as a weaker type of troop. I like the simplicity and the streamlinedness of it. You go 4 turns, you're fine. You go 5 turns, you're considered to be a class weaker. So armored becomes heavy, heavy becomes light, so on and so on. This also brings into the fact that sometimes units need to rest, and there's a tactical reason to not move, to not adjust, to just stand there and catch your breath. This is very real in mixed martial arts or any of these type of fighting things, and a wise commander would take this into consideration too. So, we talked a little bit about range combat. Let's go into this just a little bit more. So, there is a rate of fire. All units can basically fire once per turn. Certain units, like longbowmen, if they don't move, can fire twice at the end. This makes them very powerful. It also means that if you can force the longbowman to move, you reduce the effectiveness of that unit greatly. A way to defeat ranged is cover, or to move outside of the arc of fire. Split move and fire is a solid reason to have mounted troops with ranged. But again, fantasy troops could make all of this very dynamic and would definitely change the typical perception of war greatly. Some units have indirect fire. This is a way for these units to get around some cover. However, when you're doing indirect fire, it is harder to hurt the unit, and some units, like fully armored troops, basically become arrow-proof. Some types of cover are more effective than others. For example, an overhead roof against indirect fire is a lot better than a hedge. And if you have enough cover, even with indirect cover and the weakened state of the arrows or the attack, you can basically become arrow-proof. Thrown weapons are basically the same as other ranged or missile weapons, but they can be thrown on a charge. Another reason ranged is solid, shall we say. And these, of course, cannot be used as indirect. Siege weapons are important, as one might think, in a wargame. They have rules set aside for them in many areas. These rules are very complicated. I'll try and go over them the best I can, but if you want to see them better, the best way to see that is for me to actually play several games and for you to see how they are actually in play. For example, catapults have a minimum range. They also have an extended range. They do a template weapon when they hit. This means that they can hit more than one at the same time. And if they lose some crew, their rate of fire slows down. They also have an arc of fire. They count as indirect, and zeroing in your target is not easy. They used a guessing system back then, so you did not use a measuring tape to measure until you made your guess. However, it's more than that. If you think the enemy is 28 inches away, so you say that, and then you say how much is left or right from directly in front of you. So, for example, if it looks like he is 6 inches to your right, from your dead center right, you would say 28 inches, right 6. Literally like calling it out like a mortar shot. Or how I'd imagine someone to call it out like a mortar shot. Also, there were optional rules with catapults where you could undershoot or overshoot your target. You roll 2d6, each of a different color, and then you call it out, as you can see here in the optional rules. I personally think I would use this optional rule, but that's because I enjoy the randomness that I've experienced with siege equipment in other games. Gunpowder weapons can be both handheld weapons like arquebuses, basically the little hand shotgun type of thing, medieval shotguns, and cannons. Both automatically kill if they hit. Like a shotgun, greater chance to hit at longer range than it does at short range. It also ignores some of the effects of cover. But unique to them, if they are braced by a solid object, like a low wall, they get a bonus to hit. Cannons are to be taken very seriously. They come in 3 different types: light, heavy, and bombards. They are treated like catapults for rate of fire and arc of fire, but only bombards can do indirect fire. Cannons cannot fire into woods like catapults, and you have to guess how far away it is, left or right, and you have to aim for the middle of the target you're trying to hit. Cannons are also one of the more complicated things because they have its own specific tool in the form of a piece of dowel with different widths, from 5/8 to 1 inch thick, and they are 6 inches long. They're each separated by separate colors with alternating marks that are 1.5 inches long, making 4 segments, 2 of each color. So a shot from a cannon, let's say, is called a heavy field cannon. The target is guessed to be 30 inches in a straight line. Measure to the middle of the target and then place a 3/4 inch piece of dowel is selected. This dowel represents the bounce of the projectile as it screams across the battlefield. Those hit are dead. All of those seem fairly normal. It's a little surprising that a cannon cannot shoot in the woods, as I can imagine a cannonball literally blasting a hole through trees and causing debris as it went through. However, when it hits woods, it just stops. I guess that is a clean way of just saying, woods stop siege equipment. But wait, there's more. Bombards can fire like cannons, or it can fire like a catapult. It follows all the indirect rules for catapults, and the bounce is removed, but it gains a 3.5 inch template, though it does not drift left or right like a catapult. I am sure if you're using the optional rules for going for overshooting and undershooting, it would apply here as well, but it does not clearly state that. Okay, so let's get to melee. Let the chaos begin, right? Like I said at the beginning of this video, there are many types, many methods, many systems within the combat, the melee combat especially. I'm going to go through each one of these here and try not to repeat myself too much as I go over this very specific thing. There are many types of troops. This game is not limited to this list. For sure, there are others, but these are some of the examples they give. For example, there are Normans, there are Anglo-Saxons. They're basically the same thing with a different level of detail as culture and might be slightly different in their troop breakdown. In general, though, they break down into light, heavy, and armored. Then there is light horse, medium horse, and heavy horse. I really wish they would have kept the same 3 names with a light, a heavy, and an armored horse, but they didn't. And because there are fantasy types, you have special unit types as well. Charges are generally permitted when 2 units contact each other under certain conditions, like when a unit's within a 45-degree arc and they're not on a hill and they're on normal move. Basically when terrain allows. If 2 units touch each other and there is a complication, such as one's on top of a hill, then it's not considered a charge, but they are considered to be within melee. So missile troops can be different than they are in other games. For example, I can't think of any other game where you have missile troops being interplaced with foot troops. That way, if they're engaged in melee, the foot troops, they are to be pulled first. This is probably another reason why archers are such a superior unit compared to many other troops. Melee is made in the method chosen and morale is checked afterwards. But this is not for the novice, and I'm sure a great number of arguments were sparked off about how it works. What do I mean by that? Let's talk a little bit about the mass combat per se rules. Once combat is done in melee resolution, there are 4 segments on this specifically. First, you have the total losses that are calculated up, the smaller number subtracted from the larger number. Let's say that side A loses 12 and side B loses 15. You take 12 from 15, you get a factor of 3. Now this word factor, that's a word I came up with. This isn't a thing in the rules. This is probably where an editor could have helped the situation be more clear. Once you have that loss factor, a d6 is rolled. You take the loss factor times by the number rolled on the dice. In this case, I rolled a 2. So a 2 times 3 is 6. We'll keep that number. Let's call this the modified loss factor. There is a very strong chance that the loss factor will change every turn, even if you lose the same number of troops every turn because of that dice roll. Second, we do the same thing here too, but this is for the other side, and it is figured by comparing the amount of surviving troops. Let's call this the baseline factor, as you can have an outstanding round of combat, but you might have extremely few troops left. So it really doesn't matter since the next round will grind you out of existence, for example. So this would look like this. Side A is a group of 20 heavy troops. Side B is 15 armored troops. At this point, the heavy troops and armored troops do not matter. The part that matters is the value. While this is not specifically clear, I assume the meaning here is you either add or subtract from the modified loss factor depending on the piling on proof of the resilience. Does that make sense? What I mean is, side B has a modified factor loss of 6 because it lost 15 troops to sides A's 12 troops plus a d6. In this situation, the compound factor of 6 plus 5, a total of 11, is figured out. Let's call this the combat factor. To be clear, I have created 3 different titles to hopefully clarify what is here. I've also posted the original rules, so maybe my clarifications are more complicated and you're able to read it. Let me know in the comments down below if what I've said here has helped or hurts. I'm interested to know what your thoughts are. I feel like the lack of explanation here has to do with the culture of the groups that were playing. They didn't need to explain when they said these numbers are held, and people just knew what to do with them. I talked about earlier this could be a compound loss, or it could show the resilience of a unit. If it was a resilience, it's 6 minus 5 because they had more troops left. A combat factor of 1, for example. However, the best way of showing this is by having this rolled out several times and to show these scenarios versus the one I've made up here. If it was a compound loss, for example, instead of that being a 1, that would be an 11, 6 plus 5. In our situation, it actually is a 6 plus 5, making it a compound factor of 11. So, let's get to the third step. We are trying to figure out who has more points and who has fewer points. This is done by taking the number of troops present in the combat, multiplying it by the unit's strength modifier. They don't really call it that, but they do refer to unit strength sort of later. I think the term unit strength is actually a modern term that fits well here. So on our side, has 20 heavy troops. That means it's a total of a unit strength of 100. Side B has 15 armored foot for a total of 105. Wait, so side A won, but side B is stronger. That can mean that this fight is not really over with, right? I think that was what they were actually aiming to do and why this was so complicated. So now we're on to the fourth step. And now we're ready to resolve combat as we know so far. We're going to take the first 3 steps, total the scores. We'll see even though side B has more unit strength, it lost enough troops that side A won. So you subtract 11, the combat factor, from the 105, making it a 94 versus a 100. You compare those 2 numbers together and you see that there's a 6 points difference. When you look on the combat morale test, it says melee continues as normal, as in nothing really happened. It was a push. So what was the purpose of making this part so complicated? It was an attempt to move the game from a binary win, loss, kill, live scenario into something with a little bit more depth. The realism that they were trying to find, I think, is what they really pushed for here, as they found this part of the game to be so epic and swinging of the battle. They wanted to have more depth here. So we've gotten to the first 3 steps of morale combat resolution. We are trying to move it from a binary win or loss. I think that's the reason why they went into so much depth in this section. They really wanted to push it into more depth so that it was not just simply rolling dice like the Napoleonic games where it just quickly happened and, you know, you're dealing with larger units I think they were really trying to push away from the static feel of the Napoleonics games and how it felt more like a game of Risk versus a back and forth combat with mud and blood and gore. I think they were trying to go for some level of realism. I think this happens more the smaller scale of the game you're in. So if each 1-inch or 25 millimeter unit counts as 100 troops, you're not going to have the detail that you would have if each model was each model. So though you may have 200 miniatures on the battlefield, if you took a 20-man versus 20-man, you would be able to have more of a war game, gore, realism type of feel than you would in these larger games. So I think they were discovering this with the evolution of Chainmail from these other games, like the Roundhead game and all that type of stuff. I still feel like they overcomplicated this, but part of that complication is what makes this, probably once you get to know it, very elegant. One could say that the predecessors, the one I talked about earlier, the Major Wesley of Braunstein and H.G. Wells of Little Wars, were also trying to do this as their game evolved. They found this core system that worked based off of Kriegspiel, but then in Napoleonics, and then they wanted to push it into more and more realism, and they all found it a little bit. H.G. Wells, if you watch my video on that, he talks about the fact that essentially he found that it was a better game, but it was a more advanced game, and it was not for a new player, and it made it more complicated and harder to follow along. Braunstein talked about the fact that many of their things became too referee dependent, essentially, and that a lot of the times it was just more fun to have the players come up with the complications between each other versus having it directed by the referee. In this case, Major Wesley, trying to gain too much control took away some of the fun of the game when they were allowed to do their own thing. Dave Arneson never really talked about this in any of the books I've been able to find or read, but I'm sure he had his own thing, as he took many games and put it into the same thing in his Blackmoor game. His Blackmoor game was more of like a Napoleonic, Strategio, Braunstein, Chainmail evolution that was kind of all blended into one, creating a very different type of game. He also had persistent campaigns that would rage on with ventures into dungeons and stuff like that. Thus, part of the reason why it became Dungeons and Dragons eventually. All of these game designers struggle to make it realistic and streamlined at the same time. I have videos on Braunstein and Little Wars if you want to go more into this. Eventually I will have one on Blackmoor talking about this a little bit more, and I'll talk more about Greyhawk, which was Gygax's version of like a Braunstein-like game. Chainmail goes into more depth than just Survivor and those that are lost. It takes into consideration, though, of units that are flanking and units that are attacking from the rear. There are specific rules and modifiers for unit strength, as they say certain things like attacks from the rear cannot be returned and this type of stuff. So you can attack them, but they can't attack you, which really means you're going to have a very decisive win. There's also units of pursuing, whether you catch them or not, if you have captives or not, how you can do prisoner escorts to get them off the battlefield. These are all optional rules that would be used more in a campaign type of thing, or in a scenario where they were worth victory conditions to take captives. Okay, so in our made-up scenario, the armored troops lost, but it was not by enough to cause a morale test even. What really happened is it was a push. If a side lost by more than 100 points, they would rout, they would run, they would have to be pursued. If they were caught, you would have to dedicate prisoner guards to escort them off the battlefield. If you use this for additional victory conditions or for campaigns or whatever. The ratio for that was 1 per 5. So for every 5 prisoners you caught, you had to leave 1 troop to go there. This made things a little bit complicated when each miniature was worth so many troops. It means that they didn't divide evenly oftentimes. People sometimes represented this by putting wound counters on tokens, showing that a percentage of miniature was doing different things. So if you had a unit strength of, like, we'll just say like each troop counts as 4 and you had to put 2 prisoner guards, you would actually put 2 tokens down and you put 2 wounds on each token, realizing they're at half strength. And then that half strength unit would carry the prisoners off the battlefield and the other half would go on with the unit. This again is fairly complicated, makes the post-morale resolution, shall we say. It'd be probably best to play test this several times to get the different ways it would happen so you could understand how this would work out better. I'll leave this up for a deep dive if you guys want to see me go down this rabbit hole a little bit and to really get into how this troop does against that troop and how these works, and you know, any specific like really cool scenarios. Maybe even throwing in some of the fantasy elements of like elves and dwarves and halflings and this type of stuff and orcs. I think that'd be really cool. But let me know in the comments if that is something you want me to do. There was many things they took into consideration, like the weight of units, if they were wearing armor, if they had the inertia of cavalry as they came in, or even how long units have been failing on their morale rolls, if it turned from failing their morale roll to routing, for example. Okay, so I spent the last few minutes talking about the post-morale resolution. Let's talk about something completely different. Let's talk about morale. What? Wait a second. Really? Yes. Yes, we even have more morale, because there is something different than post-melee morale. There's just regular morale. So what I detailed was basically if you were in melee, what your morale was like. What happens if you get shot? What happens if you receive a charge from a unit that causes not necessarily fear and terror, because they didn't really have that back then, but like forced you to have a morale check. For example, if you're being charged by cavalry and you're a foot troop. Chainmail had those tests as well. These were like other modern games and Napoleonic games of its time. When your unit got to a certain point, usually 1/3 or 50% or whatever, they would make a check. These tests were very static, and it kind of gives you the Napoleonic feel of what I was talking about. It makes it feel a little bit more procedural and clunky to me than the post-morale resolution. But I could also understand if you had multiple versions of the post-morale resolution, that would be very difficult to follow. Again, we're somewhere between it is too complicated, it's too advanced for a player to step into and understand, versus this is just a thing. One of the more interesting things I found is not having a single unit does a specific thing. If I read this correctly, it was common that even with barbarians, to have 50% of a unit be melee with the rest being ranged. This makes a lot of sense to me on a few levels, like the effectiveness of primitive weapons and flexibility on the battlefield. For example, I could see that a unit of primitive bows not being as effective as a unit of crossbowmen, even though the unit size would be the same. Another thing to take into consideration is how it's harder to control certain units than other units. For example, on page 18 of this PDF, it talked about feudal knights tend to have an ego and do not follow the orders of others. From what I understand, they have a priority list they would rather follow versus the orders of their superior. For example, most of the time it's charge. Well, I feel like this brings some realism to the game and some non-micromanaging flavor to it. I think that this could be also, again, overly complicated and easily forgotten. There was also some discount type troops, like the Flemish pike units, which were basically a type of levy with pike weapons. Mercenaries had some special rules that showed their lack of reliability and their ability to mess over a battle or to turn their back on an army that they had said they would fight for. I could see this being especially effective in a tabletop RPG. I like this optional rule as well. Peasants are equally unreliable, but for a different reason. For example, they're not fighting for their land, they're fighting for their lord's land or some knight. Speaking of knights, not all knights are feuding. Some knights are religious. These have bonuses to morale issues and tend to have a better effect on units like peasants. There is also some other special things like English longbowmen, Magyars, whatever that is, Mongols, Poles, Russian, Saracens, Scottish infantry, Spanish, Tartars, Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, samurais, repeating crossbows. To briefly cover some of those that are in the book, as you can see, I have several of these flowing by as I talk about them. Army commanders have a lot of special rules. The basic is having them in the unit is strong. Having them near the unit is helpful. They join a unit, they can turn the morale around that turn. If they die, it's very bad and can cause panic across the entire army. It was common to use a standard objective marker, something that would be baggage or something you'd want to prevent from being pillaged. This was very important, especially if it was a campaign or tied to a Blackmoor style game. There are also optional rules. These are fairly basic to understand. I think for what it is, they work. Let's get into some more about siege rules. As you can imagine, these can be very important. We're going to go outside of the catapult and cannon now. We're going to move into some of the other stuff that would fall underneath siege. This has its own set of rules, kind of like the post-morale resolution that is different than morale. This set of rules, again, is a little bit different. They have defensive positionings, which has a point value range that is a little bit unclear. There's no dice roll, there's no exact. So maybe this is how you fill up the rest of your unit? I don't know. I guess I could see, I'm going to count this one as 40, but you know, okay, I get done with my army, I have 10 points left over. I'm going to count these two actually as 45 each, making them a little bit more resilient, worth a little bit more points, and it's like a spectrum with a maximum and a minimum that they could be on. This is a very odd and probably very culture-based, that was very specific to the Lake Geneva area. There are specific rules, though, for moving siege engines, and that seems pretty clear. But there are some things that are not covered. Like, for example, a siege engine cannot cross a ditch. However, if the ditch is filled, they can. How does the ditch become filled? Again, this probably is more of a Braunstein type of thing, where they have a referee and you have troops that go out and to try and do this specific thing so that the siege engine can ford the river or the ditch or the moat, for example. But they're not actually wrote in the rules, so if you're not there or you're looking back on it, it's hard to understand. I think if you and your table came up with a way to do this, you could figure this out pretty easily. I feel like this is a part of the game they could have spent a little more time on to sort of standardize how long it would take to fill a ditch or whatever. But I think as long as both parties agreed at the table, it would make sense. Okay, so let's get a little bit into man-to-man combat. This is the combat system that is used or suggested to be used in the actual original Dungeons & Dragons game. This is also the combat system that is used when you're dealing with fantasy units. So, for example, if a dragon enters melee, it has its own man-to-man combat value or system. So in mass combat, a single manager represents several figures, so that the scale is larger without having to have that many troops on the battlefield or having to make the map that much more bigger. It makes it much more manageable for players to move and to have these things. However, in man-to-man, combat is literally the miniature it is versus another miniature. Man or woman, it doesn't matter. Or creature, whatever it is, it is. Now, that creature, that woman, that man might count as more than one troop, but that is because of their skill and because of their strength and all that type of stuff, which isn't technically represented in a stat. They just represent it as being more people. Kind of like an engine is so many horsepower. That would be a good way of looking at it. A larger, a more powerful engine is more horsepower. Yet, and it could beat any man in like a tug of war. When I come out with my original Dungeons and Dragon rules video, shortly after that, or before that, I'm going to be doing a little bit of a solo campaign. In that campaign, I'm going to be using the man-to-man combat rules. So you'll be able to see more of that play out as the game goes on. Believe it or not, the D20 was actually considered the optional rules for about the first 15 years of the game, up until AD&D 2nd edition. And if you're wondering, AD&D 2nd edition is actually like the 5th version of the game in reality. Okay, so let's dive into this a little bit. Well, there is missile fire. Missile fire is treated as 1/20th scale with short, medium, and long range divided equally. That seems pretty standard today, to be honest. Hand-hurled weapons are treated as short bows and are very solid and standard to work with. But wait, that's not for range, that's only for hitting. Okay, well, that doesn't make sense. And it really doesn't go into sense. I assume that it's basically when you charge, that's when it would make sense. But this is covered in the weapons section much later on in the rules. It's not actually in the same section where it's talking about hurled weapons. Matter of fact, I never even found another reference to hand-hurled weapons in the PDF. So I, again, feel like this is something that was just known at the table. It was known in Lake Geneva when you were playing this game, what it meant. Or it was something that was agreed to prior to the game being played by the two people playing the game. Melee is assumed that when you are within 3 inches of an enemy model. This allows for non-standard miniatures to be used. It's hard to make base contact with certain things that are bushy or have extra limbs that stick out, or wings, for example. I like this rule, as I would argue that the combat is continuously moving, so where an actual miniature is standing doesn't really break down into what it actually is doing within that period of time. When it's talking about the rules, though, it does get a little bit difficult or hard to follow, because it kind of interchanges the attacker, the defender, and the opponent. So the attacker might be the opponent at one point or another, or the opponent could be the defender at another point. Again, I feel like this is something that would be complicated until you kind of get it. Sort of like THAC0. Once you know it, it makes sense, you understand it. Trying to describe it to someone is probably a little harder. When you watch my original Dungeons & Dragons solo campaign, you'll understand probably how that works after a few games, after a few battles. If you're not confused yet, please let me know in the comments down below. If you are confused, I apologize. Hopefully by the end of this, we'll be able to figure this out. Okay, so weapon class. The rules for this are on page 25 of the 3rd edition of the PDF. There are very specific rules that are also found on page 26. However, finding the class of the weapon is found in Appendix B on page 41, near the back of the book. So once you wrap your head around it, it makes a lot of sense. You could also just keep short notes so that you know the weapon class for that weapon, or just memorize the weapon class for that weapon. As you only have like 4 or 5 weapons, it shouldn't be too hard for you to keep track of. There are certain other things to keep in mind, like high ground, but their example's a bit wonky, as it refers to fighting from ramparts or castle walls. The reality is you're not fighting from a castle wall with someone in melee on the ground. I assume what they're making reference to is that the person is climbing up a ladder that is attached to a wall and you're fighting down the wall. I think just simply making it high ground and then having people make the assumption of what that means with a person on a ladder, or saying a person on a ladder is always considered to be on the low ground, would make more sense. Again, that's modern day polish, not necessarily something they thought of back in the day. Just like other parts of the game, it goes into a lot of detail separating mounted versus non-mounting, attacking from the rear, if they can parry or not. This depends on weapon class. If they are stunned or not, if they made the morale saves or not, if they can counterblow or not. And if you were to use a tactical option, like you can go first, but you choose not to. You choose to put some more into parry, but then turn it into like a riposte, for example. There are even special rules for Vikings and leaders, which hints that there are these rules to be expanded on in many ways. Some would see these as maybe house rules, or like if you had some fantasy hero that you wanted to make more robust. I feel like when I get into my solo campaign, I will go more into details of this. Let me know in the comments down below if you feel like I'm missing on some of this stuff and where I'm missing, so that when I do my solo campaign, I'll be more versed or better understand how to explain myself better. Moving on from the man-to-man, because there's a lot there and we could spend a lot more time on it, but this video is already fairly long as it is. Let's get into jousting. Jousting rules were actually so popular because they were basically unique to Chainmail that they are suggested in the original Dungeons & Dragons rules. And at GaryCon, where they still play Chainmail games even to this day, there's actually a specific table where they just do jousting contests. Yes, this is yet another system, like a medieval rock, paper, scissors with status as the reward. You essentially have to aim at a point of the defensive position, as in you're going to hit the person in the head or the shield or whatever. And then the defender has to defend against the position they believe you're going to hit. How far off they are or you are will change what happens on the impact. How far off your defense is versus the attack, or the attack is from the defense, will state what basically happens. There are points for knocking helmets off, dismounting your opponent, and such. They really didn't actually go too much into it. Again, this leads me to believe that there was a culture, there was a known element at the table of how this was played out. It quickly jumps into the fantasy rules. So near the back of the book, the back of the PDF, you'll find that there is the fantasy appendix, shall we say. There's basically two spectrums within fantasy. There's high fantasy, which is akin to the J.R.R. Tolkien version of the books and whatnot that you'd find back in that time. So The Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings series, Return of the King, all that type of stuff. And then there's the low fantasy. This would be much more akin to like Robert E. Howard, who is best known for writing his Conan series. There are many people in between. However, it kind of gets almost like a little snobbish with the way it says it's talking about the dedicated fantasy enthusiast to Dungeons & Dragons, which can be found in the back of this PDF. So it literally is already offering a way to expand this into a more, if you're really a dedicated fantasy enthusiast, there's this game and you want to go check it out. These games really cross-promoted each other well. Original Dungeons & Dragons promoted Chainmail, Chainmail promoted Original Dungeons & Dragons, so on and so on. It was a little bit of a funny ad placement, but again, there was no platform. They were their own platform. I'm sure if you went to the Gen Con, you were part of the IFW, or if you were part of the Lake Geneva Tactical Studios, association, you probably were inundated with these type of things. There was also a lot of these, what they call zines. And Dave Arneson had his, which was called the Corner of the Table or something like that. And Gary Gygax, or Mr. Gygax, had his own, which was started out as Strategic Review and then became Dragon Magazine, which ran for many, many episodes and for decades. Many skirmish level games these days are played with 15 to 28 millimeter scale. with many historical games going down to 2 mm scale. And often ranging between like 2 and 10, really. 6 is a classic one for sure. But due to the miniatures that were sold where Mr. Gygax was, they were on 30 or 40 mm scale. When I speak more about Mr. Gygax in his own video where I talk more about what he did in his life and all this type of stuff, I will talk more about his love for these pre-painted miniatures. Other fantasy races were scaled with these sizes to represent how they would compare to a human. I found that the Conan miniatures could be a consideration in this PDF. In my research of the Conan miniatures I found of that time, though, they tend to favor the 25 mm or the 54 mm scale. And as there was no halfling miniatures out there of those type of things really until later, you kind of were stuck with the Conan version of miniatures for a while, or just straight historical stuff. Later there was the introduction of halfling sprites, dwarves, goblins, elves, orcs, this type of stuff. So many of these things were represented by toys or whatever they got from the supermarket. The PDF takes a moment of time here to discuss what the differences between a hero and a superhero is. These rules actually came from the Blackmoor setting, where in the Braunstein they had heroes and superheroes. This transferred over to Mr. Arneson's work in Blackmoor, where he would have the same type of thing. It was a persistent campaign with experience that was gained, and the units would get, or the character would get stronger over time. Again, you can see a lot of Tolkien influence throughout here. Even after the changing of hobbits to halflings, a lot of things they still had going on. One of the interesting things is where they sided. So during this time, Disney had dwarves. Those dwarves were very different than J.R.R. Tolkien's dwarves. Matter of fact, I'll go into this whenever I talk about Mr. Tolkien. Mr. Tolkien did not like Disney's dwarves. He disliked them so much he spelt them different. A dwarf in Disney is spelled D-W-O-R-F-S. Dwarves in J.R.R. Tolkien's, which is the way probably most of us spell dwarves, is spelled D-W-A-R-V-E-S. Mr. Tolkien was also a linguist, so this is the reason why he spelt it, and it was so important for him to spell it differently. And the one thing that Mr. Tolkien did have is he never wanted the Disney to ever make any of his movies or cartoons of his books, because he disliked the representation of dwarves so much. I'll go more into that basically whenever I do a video on that. If you want to see that sooner versus later, let me know in the comments though. Ironically, even though Mr. Gygax favored the melee, favored the Conans of this world, one of the greatest enemies or bad guys that he always saw in the sword and sorcery was wizards. And there was a lot of love shown for the wizards. In reality, this could have been the first game ever called Wizard Tower Defense, with the amount of information that was put in the wizards, where most troops were lucky to get a paragraph. A wizard got a full 3 pages of information, as you can see here. Creatures of mythology, though, were also present in the fantasy appendix. There were wraiths, lycanthropes, with other shape changers, true trolls, as well as ogres, which are kind of treated as the same type of thing. Treants still remained. Dragons, rocks, elemental, basilisks, i.e. cockatrices and chimeras and that type of stuff. Giant spiders or insects, giant wolves, but last or not least was the wights and ghouls, which were discussed in more detail. Why heroes and superheroes and wizards were in the middle, I am not sure. That was a choice they made, and I guess it made a lot of sense to them. There are a heap of specialty rules for this fantasy supplement, or whatever you call it, appendix, as you can imagine. And I cannot go into it all here. As you can see, it added a dynamic to the game that would take it well outside the realm of a historical game. it went into more detail on certain things, like dragons having different types of breath weapons, which were not covered in even the original Dungeons and Dragons. The evolution of certain things that did not make it, such as acid breath, lightning breath, cold, versus a standard fire, per se, that you found in the original Dungeons and Dragons. As a matter of fact, there wasn't even acid or lightning resist in the original Dungeons and Dragons. But everything was kind of changing rapidly. So you get the point. Things are kind of chaotic and crazy, and a lot of culture and tabletop knowledge of like house rules were basically played in the game. It was known back then that, at least in Dungeons and Dragons, no two games were played exactly the same. My thought was probably very similar for Chainmail. There was a bunch of agreed to things, but not two games of Chainmail with different players that never met each other would ever be the same. Okay, so the fantasy combat table, where is it? Well, it's listed as Appendix E. Here you can see things like elves, heroes, certain magic users, the different types, those that can wield magic weapons. For the most part, it was pretty simple, but there were some very oddly specific things like Odin's spear and Thor's hammer. The original names probably were used at the table. However, I don't know if Mjorn would be something that would be copyrighted. I feel like that would be. And Odin's spear, which I believe is Gundar, I believe is probably copyrighted too. I guess I'll go into more of that specifically when I talk about the supplement Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, which did run into some copyright issues for Dungeons and Dragons. So beyond the magic weapons, there was enchanted arrows and magic armor. It also made reference to that there are some certain house rules, which probably took it outside of the copyright realm, because a lot of this was flavored or based upon what people knew to be fantasy back then. So they probably couldn't detail it specifically in the book itself. This version of the game also added the potential of Erevmoon, which added a Z-axis to the X and Y of other war games. This changes the complete dynamics of everything. While they don't really go into that specifically, as in I don't think you can hit a unit flying with a cannon, or maybe you can, but you're not going to bounce into anything else, and where the cannonball goes is probably completely unknown. I have grouped Appendix D and E here together. Please pause the video to take in all the information that can be found here, as there is quite a rich story for this game that was unique for its time. Are there modern versions of this that are better? Oh, for sure. But this was the first, and it certainly is worth discussing, in my opinion. Okay, so the conclusion of all this. Well, this game changed a lot from the days of Roundheads to this edition, and from this edition to what is being played, from this edition, the third edition of Chainmail, to what was released later by Wizard of the Coast in around 2000, which changed a lot too. Later editions went more to a skirmish-like game, like that of Chronopia or Vor, two games you probably have never even heard of. The early concepts, i.e. first edition, were more of the Napoleonics and Roundhead types. Let me know in the comments down below if you want me to talk more about the Wizard of the Coast. As you can see, I do have many of the miniatures for that version of the game. I was actively playing Dungeons & Dragons in 2000. And I liked the fact that I could get many of the miniatures I wanted in this Chainmail version of the game, even if I didn't play Chainmail. And I did play some of the Chainmail, but it really didn't kick off like other games were. And I played a lot of other games. Okay guys, well thank you for watching this video so far. Like, subscribe if you haven't done that already. Hit the notification bell if you want to see more about this. This video took an incredibly amount of time. I want to say researching, I probably spent, I bet it was 50 hours researching this. I'm not going to see a return on that. This was a video of passion for me. I wanted to put out a good video. I wanted to really do the whole 2024 right by D&D, and the fact it's the 50th anniversary. This is going to be part of that, as it is a pinnacle, critical part of the D&D history. Look for my original Dungeons & Dragons solo game, which I'm going to be using the chainmail rules for man-to-man for combat, just to see how it would play out back in those days. But yeah, we're going to be doing more things like this. This is Dungeon, the board game. This will be my next video in the series before I get into really original Dungeons & Dragons. This has a lot to do with sort of the integration of chainmail rules into Dungeons & Dragons. Chainmail rules are basically used in this board game even to this day. There is a difference between the editions. The original edition that came out was a little bit different. I do find those occasionally on eBay. However, the cost is not prohibitive for me to get it at this point in time. If that's a video you really want me to see, help me motivate my wife to allow me to get this, and write in the comments below and give me a whole bunch of likes. Anyways, guys, let me know what you guys think. I appreciate it. Keep watching this video, and as I always say, keep rolling those dice.